Good morning. We're going to get started. Good morning, everybody. Buenos dias, and welcome to the Inter-American Dialogue. It's a pleasure to have everybody with us this morning, and for an event on corruption, crisis, and CICIG. What next for the rule of law in Guatemala? The United Nations International Commission Against Impunity emerged over the last decade as one of America's most innovative and effective mechanisms for combating corruption. Unsurprisingly, its success has also garnered it some powerful enemies. Today, the president of Guatemala, Jimmy Morales, himself is a target of investigation and into illicit donations to his campaign. Morales announced last month that he would not renew CICIG's mandate when it expires next year, and subsequently permitted Commissioner Ivan Velásquez from returning to Guatemala in defiance of an order from the Constitutional Court in that country. These developments have profound implications for Guatemala's democratic institutions and the rule of law, but also for its investment climate and its foreign relations, including with the United States. Today, we have an expert panel that will look closely at what's happened so far, what may happen next, and what it all means for Guatemala and the region. The session will be moderated by Michael Camilleri, who is director of the Dialogue's Rule of Law program and has done a really spectacular job with his reports and meetings and activities, and has focused a lot on the corruption question, not only in Guatemala and Central America, but more broadly throughout the Americas. So I really want to thank Michael for making this happen. I also want to thank our four speakers. Michael will introduce them, but I do want to welcome Connie and Robin, who are here for the first time speaking, and thank you for joining us. We also want to thank Eduardo Stein, who has been an Inter-American Dialogue member for many, many years, and he was a member of our board of directors, and he's been a very close friend and colleague of the Dialogues. And also Eric Jacobstein, who will speak. Eric, although he doesn't admit this publicly, worked at the Dialogue, and he did our work with Congress when he was here. And now he's been on the Hill for almost 13 years, so he obviously liked that work. I also want to acknowledge and thank Eric Farnsworth, who we're partnering with the Council of the Americas on this event, and it's great to welcome him. He's the Executive Vice President for the Council and also the Director of the Washington office, and he runs a superb program at the Council as well. Finally, let me just thank Open Society Justice Initiative for supporting this event. And I'm sure it's going to be very interesting and very stimulating. With that, let me turn it over to Eric, who makes some opening remarks as well. Eric?
Michael, thank you. Thank you for welcoming us into your home. It is a privilege and a pleasure to be here. And I would simply say back at you for the kind words you said about me, I would say the same about you. So congratulations on the fine work you do. And it is a privilege to be here at the Inter-American Dialogue to partner on a program of such meaning and importance today. I also want to thank Michael Camilleri and Anna Kobe from my staff, as she's here somewhere, for the hard work putting this important program together today. As all of you know, the Council of the Americas and America's Society are sister organizations dedicated to the promotion of democracy, open markets, and the rule of law. Each of these broad areas of emphasis is affected by and undermined by corruption, which is at bottom an anti-democratic tax on those least able to afford it. That's why we're so focused on efforts to root out corruption across the hemisphere. In a word, corruption makes economies less competitive and subject to manipulation and higher risk. I've just returned from a mission actually to Guatemala where I and my colleagues saw firsthand the damage that corruption can do to competitiveness and the interest of investors to invest. And these are not just minor manners, but they are long-term and they are lasting. The private sector wants a fair and transparent investment regime in Guatemala and across all of Central America. And for investment to flourish, creating good jobs in the formal economy, leading to the economic growth and development that each one of us seeks, corruption must be pulled out, root and branch. This is not about ideology, ladies and gentlemen, or politics. It's about economic competitiveness and reality in the global economy. To paraphrase a former president, anti-corruption is not left or right, it's math. And so we are focused on these issues and mindful of the importance of international efforts to function as corruption disruptors to bring transparency and the rule of law to these very important issues. And it's why we have partnered today with the Inter-American Dialogue to feature this panel on Guatemala and the important role of CICIG in that country. And we hope that it will bring clarity, the program today will bring clarity and understanding and meaningful progress on these very important and very timely issues. So again, I just want to thank the Dialogue for the partnership and for the meaningful program this morning. It's a privilege to be partnering with you today. And to turn it over to my friend Michael Camilleri to run the panel discussion that follows. Michael.
Thanks, Eric. Thank you for those great framing comments, and again, terrific to partner with the Council of the Americas on this event. We are really fortunate today to be joined by a stellar panel to discuss this issue at a really kind of critical time for Guatemalan democracy. I think many of us probably woke up this morning to news of the convictions in the case of the Guatemala Social Security Institute, in the case of the corrupt contract for dialysis treatment that ended up resulting in the death of over 50 people. I think it's, sometimes corruption can seem like a victimless crime, and it's a reminder that it's not, that corruption can kill, and of the stakes that are of these issues in this conversation. So an important time to be doing this for many reasons. To my right here, Dr. Eddie Stein is a former Vice President of Guatemala, former Foreign Minister, and he played a critical role actually in negotiating the agreement that brought CICIG to Guatemala. That agreement was signed in December 2006. To my left, Connie de Pais is a Guatemalan business leader. Heads Pani Fresh, is also the Vice President of the Guatemalan Export Association. Rachel Samron is Executive Vice President of Millicom, and Eric Jacobstein is Senior Policy Advisor with the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So they will all, I think, add important and unique perspective and insight on these issues. So thank you again all for joining us. We're going to jump right into a conversation here. I will moderate the discussion for about 45 minutes, and then we'll leave plenty of time for your questions and comments. And I should mention, Connie will be speaking in Spanish, so if anybody would like a headset for translation, they are available at the table back there. So, Vice President Stein, you were Vice President when I lived in Guatemala, so you'll always be Vice President to me. It's been a turbulent few weeks in your country. President Morales announced that he would not renew the CICIG mandate. He subsequently prohibited Commissioner Ivan Velásquez from returning to Guatemala. That's still the case. And he maintained that prohibition seemingly even after the Constitutional Court ordered him to reverse it. So can you give us, I'm tempted to ask what the heck is happening in Guatemala, but maybe I'll put maybe I'll to be a little more specific, can you give us some insight into what's driving President Morales' actions, and how concerned we should be about the implications of these actions for Guatemalan democracy and rule of law more broadly?
Let me start by saying that probably the end strategic aim of President Morales and his closest team is to get rid of CICIG altogether. They have argued publicly that the commissioner is a threat to Guatemalan internal security, and they have signaled as well quite clearly through different voices close to the government or part of the cabinet that they want a downgraded CICIG if it is to remain in Guatemala until September of next year, where its mandate ends. More like, I don't know, like a workshop provider of sorts, like a training center. But they want CICIG to stop investigating criminal cases. And I want to stress this issue because the birth of CICIG itself was indeed triggered and fueled because of the internal infection of our justice system in general. That is why in the mandate of CICIG, there is a direct reference to a type of cysts or internal cells that were created during the war years within the government in the three powers of the state that have indeed hampered the true, free, and dynamic development of democratic institutions. So we are looking at perhaps a very specific case, which is CICIG itself and the role of the commissioner. But behind that, what we are seeing is, to some of us, an effort to go back to situations of the past in which Guatemala will be retreating from its pathway to a rule of law. I would say this is a very important strategic way of looking at things. Secondly, although this will require more detailed explanations, we are in the midst of the beginning of all of the electoral process in Guatemala, the presidential part of which will take place next year, but all of the parties have started already to prepare their regional and local assemblies to determine their candidacies. And what we see is a push, not necessarily is the responsibility of the government, but a push of different political forces to stop or even dismantle potential candidacies and political parties that could present a dignified, integral view of this strengthening of our democratic institutions effort. In other words, these forces want to stop any options of future valid candidacies that would continue the strengthening of our democratic system. And finally, I think we have seen and we are seeing increasing signals and indications that some structures of intimidation that we thought were over with the peace accords are again being reborn. There are direct threats to judges in the justice system at all levels, beginning with the Constitutional Court. And we see a very dangerous situation if the government, the executive, is successful in the efforts to disband the present Constitutional Court. We will find ourselves in a very, very grave internal institutional crisis that no one really knows how to go about resolving.
Thank you. Connie, that's a pretty dire picture that Dr. Stein paints. Let me turn to you for a perspective from the private sector. What are you seeing? How do you interpret recent developments? And what do you think the impact is on the Guatemalan investment climate of these developments?
Bueno, quisiera empezar tal vez hablando del clima para los negocios que se está viviendo ahorita en Guatemala. Realmente hay mucha tensión, mucha incertidumbre. La economía en Guatemala es en su mayoría privada, entonces sí se necesita mucha confianza en el país para que las inversiones vengan y para que sigamos trayendo más trabajo al país, que es lo que se necesita. Tanto el Banco Mundial, el FMI y el sector privado está de acuerdo en que el desarrollo del capital humano, el Estado de Derecho y la infraestructura son los principales bases para que una economía crezca. En Guatemala tenemos al capital humano. Realmente Guatemala tiene uno de los índices más altos de desnutrición. Arriba del 50%, no se ha podido tener un programa constante que ayude a bajar esos números. La educación, hemos logrado llegar a la primaria casi un 85% arriba que de la gente que termine la primaria, pero todavía no llegamos a un 90% y la secundaria tenemos números abajo del 50%. Entonces, la educación tampoco está funcionando y la infraestructura, tenemos 5 años en Guatemala sin invertir en un nuevo kilómetro de carretera. Estamos más o menos a la tercera parte de la cantidad de carreteras que necesitamos para conectar a toda Guatemala, que eso lleva desarrollo también a los lugares donde hay conexión. Los puertos están en la misma situación, no ha habido inversión de mantenimiento, aunque las exportaciones han crecido, no hay inversión para crecer los puertos. Este fin de año creemos que los puertos van a colapsar con la cantidad de volumen de entrada y salida que tiene y no estamos viendo ninguna solución para eso. Con todas estas cosas que están pasando y aparte el clima de negocios, las inversiones, la gente está asustada, no hay inversión, la gente está esperando a ver qué pasa para poder invertir. La situación no ayuda, la situación de los otros países cercanos a Guatemala tampoco. Entonces yo sí creo que podíamos hablar que la situación se está volviendo, la economía está totalmente parada. Necesitamos empezar a tomar acciones claras que nos den seguridad al sector privado para que podamos empezar a trabajar. El sector privado es el que da el trabajo. Necesitamos de veras poder dar más trabajo en Guatemala, que la migración pare. Nos gustaría mucho poder desarrollar, poder traer muchas empresas, pero la verdad que cada vez se está poniendo peor y la gente no cree que vayamos a salir en un mediano plazo y estamos esperando a ver qué pasa en las elecciones del año que viene. Entonces, creo que mi posición es que la lucha contra la corrupción es lo más importante que podemos hacer ahorita, ya que dimos el paso. Pero la lucha de la corrupción y hacer planes concretos para que vayamos haciendo que la economía se vaya moviendo y que no nos quedemos estancados.
Muy bien, gracias, Connie. Rachel, from the perspective of a foreign investor in Guatemala, I believe Millicom is the biggest taxpayer, one of the biggest employers in the country. Maybe you could tell us a little bit, first of all, about what you do, what your company does in Guatemala, and then we can get your perspective on some of these issues.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Thank you, Michael. So Millicom, for those of you who don't know, is a mobile and cable operator as well as a mobile money provider. Millicom is the name under which we trade on the Stockholm Stock Exchange, but the brand name is in fact Tigo. Tigo Guatemala is a joint venture between ourselves and a local partner where we own 55% of the business. And as Michael mentioned, we are indeed one of the largest private sector enterprises in the country. We are the largest mobile provider, the largest broadband and cable TV provider. We are indeed, I believe, according to the Ministry of Finance, the largest taxpayer in the country, have thousands of employees and generate employment for another, I think, around 40,000 or so people in the country, and among one of the largest investors, and I think we represent about 16% of all foreign investment going into the country.
So with that in mind, you are in a lot of developing markets. How important are corruption issues to your investment decisions, and what is your perspective on the recent events that we've seen in Guatemala?
Well, I think Eric summarized perfectly why corruption needs to be rooted out, at all levels. Corruption increases inequality, it decreases efficiency, it decreases competitiveness. It simply, from any investor's perspective, is just not good to have around. And that is not a Guatemala-specific problem. That is something that applies to all the countries that we invest in. And this is not just our view. This is also a view that comes from our investors. We have to remember, it's not only about our investment decision. Our investment dollars come from investors from around the globe, from Stockholm, from London, from New York, and they look at these issues as well, especially those who are so-called ESG investors who really look very closely at institutional frameworks that exist in countries, whether that's Guatemala or elsewhere, and that take a very, very close look at where do they want to take the risk versus the returns. Now, corruption adds to the cost of business. I believe some of the IMF and World Bank numbers really are quite staggering if you look at it. $1.5 trillion paid on average annually in bribes alone. That's an incredible amount of money that could be spent instead in socioeconomic development. It adds about 10% to the cost of doing business. Again, for someone like ourselves that are operating or have a product that is vital to creating a digital economy, to building the digital highways, to really help countries sort of leapfrog the emerging markets that we're in, to be part of the global digital economy. That is a tremendous number that we're talking about. And I think in general also investment into countries that are perceived to be less corruption-free, I think is 5% lower on average, according to the IMF, than those that are seen to be relatively free of corruption. So it's a tremendous obstacle for investment in general. Now, we are a long-term investor in Guatemala. Guatemala has taken enormous strides over the last 10 years with the help of a number of its institutions, CICIG, Ministerio Público, and others, to really improve when it comes to these issues and to really fight corruption. That has been important to us. That is important to any investor in the country. As a company, we have a zero-tolerance policy when it comes to bribery and corruption that applies globally in all our markets at all levels. We simply will not accept it. And we want to also be seen as a company that helps drive that positive change to make sure that that is something that's spread also amongst, the wider private sector. So I think from our perspective, the work that we've seen in Guatemala has been tremendously important. Of course, some concerns as to what is happening now and what are the next steps on that front.
Terrific. Eric, let me turn to you. And anti-corruption has also been a priority, I would say a long-standing bipartisan priority of U.S. foreign policy in Central America and Guatemala for some time. We've seen some softening in the support specifically for CICIG from the Trump administration in the last few weeks, and we'll get into that. But maybe just to start broad, I mean, can you speak from the perspective of HVAC and your boss, Congressman Engel, about what U.S. interests are in Guatemala and how combating corruption fits into those interests, and specifically the role of CICIG and why the U.S. has been such a strong supporter historically, going back to its creation.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Michael. And I think it's very interesting. I mean, I'll focus a bit on corruption, but to start, when you sort of look at the history, go back to 2007, when CICIG was created and the immediate bipartisan support that you had for the commission. And we were talking about earlier, I think a lot of it goes back. I remember when Vice President Stein was up working Capitol Hill and pushing on it. Corruption was a piece of it, and that's sort of the topic du jour right now in Washington and the region. But a lot of the rationale for CICIG in Congress and sort of in the executive branch here was the important role it could play in combating organized crime, in combating drug trafficking. And those are foreign policy goals across both political parties. And so I think from the very start, it was almost remarkable that you had Democrats and Republicans coming together on an issue like this related to Central America. And you've had that strong bipartisan support for a long time. And then in the summer of 2014, with the crisis of migrant children coming up from Central America, there are obviously differences between the two political parties as it pertains to immigration enforcement, as it pertains to the border. But when you look at the root causes of child migration, there is a general bipartisan consensus that we need to invest more in the region. And one part of that is the corruption agenda, is combating organized crime. And CICIG was looked as something that was really essential and doing a terrific job in going after corruption, going after organized crime networks, going after drug trafficking. And so you saw, like you said, we can get into later sort of the breakdown of that bipartisan consensus. But for a number of years, you've really seen no disagreement on these issues. And one piece of that, of course, is that, Guatemala is not a front burner issue. It's not North Korea. It's not Iran. It's not Russia. But at the same time, among the foreign policy voices who care most about the region, about Guatemala, CICIG has been generally seen as helping to drive change and helping to fight corruption. And that's been important to members on both sides of the aisle.
Great. One of the things that I'm sure you'll mention that has gotten the attention of U.S. policymakers and certainly many observers in the United States was the image of U.S.-donated military jeeps circling in front of CICIG and the Constitutional Court and some human rights organizations after the announcement that the CICIG mandate would not be renewed, and that announcement itself was done by President Morales in the presence of several dozen military officers. And I think it raised some questions, Dr. Stein, about the role of the military. We know that President Morales came to office on the ticket of a party associated with some former military officers. How are we to sort of understand what seems like a bit of a throwback in terms of the role that the military may be playing in these policy conversations, or at least in carrying out the president's edicts?
I'm tempted to ask you to repeat the question so that I can think better what to answer. Let me talk in at least 3 different registers. What happened in August 31st was really a very carefully crafted set of public impact images that brought back to many of the Guatemalan population who experienced part of the internal armed conflict images of the worst repressive years. The fact that the president was at the main hall of the National Palace surrounded by uniformed people from the different military forces and police forces triggered these images immediately. But also the fact that it was accompanied by these, I don't know how to call it, but ostensibly intentional show of military vehicles donated by the United States with the main intention of taking care of faraway frontier passageways of drug trafficking, contraband, etc., bringing into the Guatemalan capital city and stationed in front of the U.S. Embassy, stationed in front of CICIG, stationed in front of several other public buildings, including the Constitutional Court. Someone had to carefully craft this image impact scenario to show that the president had the full support of security forces in the country. A lot of people are beginning to doubt that. Because we have heard, and some we have personally heard, younger officers within the Guatemalan Army complain about the behavior and the decisions of their topmost officers in command of the Army. And this was perhaps brought forth in a very forceful way when it was discovered that the president was receiving an extra bonus from the armed forces budget just for being the commander-in-chief of the military. And I personally heard from at least one retired high-ranking officer saying, my monthly retirement check is 5,000 quetzales. And here we have a 50,000 quetzal check on a monthly basis to the president, but also added bonuses to the Minister of Defense, the Vice Minister of Defense, etc. They don't agree with this type of behavior of the military chiefs. So this has also given birth to speculation about the true support of the Army to these public policy impact-making images and decisions. And this, of course, brings back as well what happened with President Serrano, who tried to dissolve the powers of the state when he found it was impossible to keep funneling money to Congress in order to get decisions that he needed. And the Constitutional Court said it just couldn't be done. He counted on the support of the Army, which in practice he did not have. He had just part of the high-ranking officers backing him, but the bulk of the Guatemalan Army respected the decision of the Constitutional Court. Situation then was quite different from today, but just to tell you how imprecise the scenario is if there is a clash of the ongoing opposition between the executive and the Constitutional Court.
Yeah. Speaking of clashes, Connie, we know that the business community in Guatemala has been divided over CICIG, and especially lately there have been voices that are more critical of CICIG and seem to be accompanying the decision of President Morales to try to end the mandate. What can you tell us about maybe what's behind some of those views, some of those divisions, and why are you still so solid in thinking that Guatemala needs to follow through on this campaign of legality and strengthening of the rule of law?
Sí. El sector privado realmente apoya la lucha contra la corrupción. No se puede romper el orden constitucional y realmente se quiere mantener el Estado de Derecho. Para el sector privado poder trabajar en un país tenemos que tener reglas claras, leyes que ayuden al desarrollo del país, pero que también ayuden a la inversión y a toda la actividad económica. Desde el 2015 empezaron a salir muchos casos después de la línea. Ayer me metí en la página de la CICIG y son más o menos encontradas 60 estructuras de corrupción y 680 personas llevadas a juicio. O sea, realmente está tocando mucha gente ya en el país. Los procesos, cuando son así de complicados, no son perfectos y hay que irlos viendo cómo van funcionando y arreglando las cosas que no están funcionando. Hay muchos detalles de los juicios y mucha gente enfrentada con opiniones diferentes de qué están pasando en los juicios. Entonces, esa situación hace que el tema de la CICIG se vuelva complicada. Yo creo que lo más importante para nosotros es en Guatemala evaluar la necesidad de seguir esa lucha contra la corrupción y la importancia de entender que solos, sin la CICIG, no lo podemos hacer. Todavía nuestro Ministerio Público y nuestro sistema judicial no está fortalecido y hay que ponerle mucha atención a que todo el proceso que se haga de aquí en adelante un plan muy importante de traspaso de esas capacidades para que se puedan ir fortaleciendo y Guatemala pueda quedarse en un mediano tiempo sin la CICIG. Pero en mi opinión personal es muy importante que la lucha contra la corrupción siga.
Gracias, Connie. Rachel, you mentioned Millicom has been in Guatemala for a long time, since before CICIG was there. Can you give us the perspective of your company on how the business climate, how the culture has changed, if it's changed for the better, and to what extent it's had an impact on the decisions that you make as a company with regard to Guatemala?
Sure. I think I'll probably split that into a couple of different parts. I mean, first of all, of course, we look very much at the economic climate, the culture that comes with that. And Guatemala has done very well. I mean, if you look at the last 3 to 4 years on average, it has grown, I think it is 3.5% GDP compared to 0.6 for the whole Latin America region. I mean, that's quite a difference. Even the forecast looking at up to 2020, expected to be about 3.2% versus an average for the region of 2.7 for Central America and 2.2 for Latin America overall. So first of all, it is a very good macroeconomic climate. Secondly, it's a country that we believe has great opportunities in terms of the population. And when I say the population, I mean the potential labor force, potential consumer base. It's a country with a very young and energetic population, 50% under the age of 25. If you look at the labor force, I think at least 60% have had an intermediate education. Now, I don't disagree with anything that has been mentioned by other panelists here, but those are very strong, positive signs for an investor. That does also influence the culture, certainly the culture within the company. A lot of energy, a lot of ambition, a lot of want to be part of a company that helps drive that digital economy that I referred to earlier. But as I said, as a company, we have a zero tolerance policy. And we do believe that the work that has been undertaken, that's a zero tolerance policy with regards to corruption, by the way. We do believe that the work that has been undertaken over the last 10 years has been helpful. It has indeed helped set some standards, some benchmarks, as Connie referred to, in terms of how the private sector should operate. And I think that's something that it's coming to a level where that's what we're more used to seeing in certain other parts of the world, which is welcomed by investors. At the end of the day, it is a question of wanting to be competitive, but being competitive in a fair way, with transparency, with clear understanding of where the markets are heading, what the opportunities are, and with a clear opportunity to fight and win any opportunity in an open and transparent manner. So absolutely, it has contributed significantly to creating that culture. But like I said, it's something where we look at it holistically. We're a long-term investor, especially given the business we're in. It's not something that comes and goes overnight. You look at the bigger picture, and there's some very good and strong positive indicators in terms of the staff, the population, the future in terms of energy and ambition. But of course, the other side of that, rule of law, strong institutions, and indeed a very fair and transparent environment to operate in is equally important, no question.
Terrific. Let me just stay with you for a second because we have a very educated and informed audience here at the dialogue, and some of our audience members will know that Tigo was actually on the receiving end of a raid by CICIG and the Ministerio Público last year. So can you speak to sort of the nature of the investigation and the status of it, and what would you say to those who might be surprised to hear you express such wholehearted support for strengthening the rule of law, for transparency, for the work of CICIG, notwithstanding this investigation?
As you rightly said, TIO Guatemala's offices were raided November of last year. Now, I'm going to give the answer that you don't want because it's very boring and very short in that, quite frankly, when it comes to what has happened since, nothing that we know about, and we simply do not know whether, as a result of that, TIGO or TIGO employees or affiliates or associates are the target of any investigation, or whether this had to do with something else that might not be directly targeted at TIGO. So that is the honest and truthful answer that I can give you. Now, having said that, we do believe that CICIG, Ministerio Público, and all other government entities are very professional, very thorough in their work. That is something that we've always thought and we continue to think. Perhaps at times with some of these raids, it can tend a little bit towards the theatrical, but I think that would be the same in any other country if you were to compare to some of the scenes you will have seen when it comes to national or international anti-corruption bodies. That's a shame because I do believe and we think as a company that perhaps takes a little bit of the credibility that we know that otherwise the institution has away from them and takes away a little bit of the very thorough and good work done. Now, to the second part of your question, as I said, we are very clear as a company that as one of the largest investors in whatever market that might be, we have not just an opportunity, but we have a responsibility to be a positive agent of change. We have a zero tolerance corruption policy. That means that, whatever is required in terms of rule of laws and institutions to help address market structure, that is what needs to happen. Now that might sound that might not have been the answer you expected. You might have asked me or expected me to answer by saying that, of course we want all these things to go away, but that doesn't help anyone. As we said, for all the reasons that we've heard, corruption is a problem that is enormously taxing on any country, socially, economically, politically, and democratically. And as a long-term investor, in particular of the size that we are, with an interest in having a growing and developing middle class and having an educated population and having a great talent pool to recruit from and great consumer base, those things do matter.
Terrific. Thank you. Eric, let's dive in on where the administration is on this. There was a bipartisan letter that was sent by your boss, Congressman Engel, Chairman Royce, Chairman Corker, and Ranking Member Menendez in the Senate, expressing both support for CICIG and some concerns about what seems to be a shifting position by the administration, a supportive tweet sent by Secretary Pompeo after the decision by President Morales to end the CICIG mandate was announced. Can you give us some insight into why you think this shift has happened, and have you, subsequent to that letter, have you had any communication from the administration, any response or explanation of why they seem to be softening on the longstanding bipartisan support that you discussed?
I think for me the bottom line with regard to CICIG is the loudest voices have really prevailed on an issue that's not really front burner in U.S. foreign policy. And I think the Guatemalan government, to a degree, has been effective in capitalizing on sort of a lack of policy direction from this administration on Central America. They've seen President Trump's desire for countries around the world to move their embassies to Jerusalem, something which, for the record, my boss, Congressman Engel, is very supportive of, but doesn't think that necessarily gives a country a free pass on everything else. There's the Taiwan-China issue as well. So I think, what you have here is, naysayers in Congress have been able to sort of take advantage of this lack in policy direction. Also looking at things like the Bitkov case, a specific case I think many of you know about, which enabled some people who were not fans of CICIG to say that CICIG was connected to the Russians, which, had no merit at all. And sort of, using Russia as a boogeyman in a way that I think we've seen Castro Chavismo used in the past. So, again, what happens? The loudest voices in opposition prevail, even though you have this long-time bipartisan support. I think what helped to turn the tide a little bit on this was what you described. I mean, this incident where these Jeeps that were donated by the U.S. government were used to intimidate CICIG and the U.S. Embassy, and then Secretary of State Pompeo immediately responding with a positive tweet about Guatemala and their relationship, which a lot of us on Capitol Hill, and I don't want to speak for any other member of Congress, but a lot of us saw as pretty outrageous. And I think that's where, you were able to get some bipartisan forces coming together. You mentioned the letter. There's also a statement from the chairman of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee and the ranking member of that subcommittee, saying, look, we support CICIG. We don't think it's the right thing to get rid of Ivan Velásquez. We don't think it's the right thing to go in and intimidate the U.S. Embassy. In terms of response to the letter, we haven't got an official response. And I also don't think it's game over in terms of U.S. support for CICIG. I think, there's been a weakening in the U.S. position. I think to a degree with Secretary Pompeo's tweet, he cut off at his knees some of the embassy staff working in Guatemala, some of the personnel. And I also don't think it's a career employee versus political appointee thing. I think there are folks, on both sides of the issue within the administration. But I do think the Guatemalan government has been able to capitalize on some of these fractures and the fact that Guatemala is not a high priority issue. But I do think there's still an opportunity for Congress and for folks in the administration to continue to support CICIG, to continue to support the strengthening of these institutions in Guatemala.
Thanks, Eric. Dr. Stein, I'm struck by your comments and Connie's, and by the sense that while CICIG has had some really almost unimaginable successes over the last decade, and really consequential advances in accountability in particular, and strengthening the Ministerio Público and empowering strong and capable individuals within the Guatemalan government to do their work. It all seems so fragile in some ways. There's this sense that it could all fall apart so quickly. But I wonder if that's accurate, and I wonder if you could give us some historical perspective on what the factors were that led you to come up with this innovative, one of a kind sort of model a decade ago. To what extent those factors have been neutralized or minimized by the work of CICIG over the last decade, and as an extension of that, what would be the consequences? What would Guatemala look like if President Morales is successful in his desire to either expel the mission or at least weaken it to a point where it's just doing some of the capacity building exercises that you mentioned, but not actually have the ability to investigate?
How many hours do we have?
3 minutes.
Let me start connecting this perspective with the international arena and U.S. policy. Several years ago, when we were successfully getting out of internal armed conflicts in Central America and the different peace processes were advancing, we were sort of accustomed to read the U.S. policy towards the region in very clear-cut terms. It was State Department who was calling the shots, coordinating most of the policy issues. And we were trained to read between the lines of documents that were formally circulated. Now we are retrained and relearning how to interpret tweets from different origins and emotional, momentous situations which almost change by the day, sometimes by the hour. At least from the outside, we do see fractures within the United States governmental institutional scaffolding. And although Eric said that it is not an issue of professional career diplomats versus political appointees, the fact is that in several of the issues of international policy, we are seeing incoherence elements. And this impinges upon what we were trying to do from the very outset, and where we mustered a lot of international support, not only from the United States, but from other donor countries, because first they knew that our justice system was infected. It was not capable of delivering true results that were equitable for all of the population in Guatemalan terms. And as Connie mentioned, it was quite an unbalanced system, still is. So CICIG has been a sort of, let me put it this way, a sort of leader in the type of reform mechanisms that abiding by transparency procedures are able to reform sectors of our justice system. CICIG had to be devised and set up and implemented to deal with one of the thorniest of issues within our own justice system, which was impunity. The justice system in Guatemala was in such a weakened way of performing that more than 90% of the criminal cases that were presented to the court system ever went to a final decision or ruling. So this type of role, we wanted it to be extended gradually. Thinking of CICIG as a prototype, of course, it was a temporary mechanism that could contaminate in a positive way the rest of the justice system in a structural reform of the judiciary. It has not yet happened. And so the importance of the fight against corruption through a mechanism like CICIG goes well beyond the boundaries of just the fight against corruption. It is geared towards obtaining a more structural transformation of our judiciary. And the last element I want to underscore in this regard is the fact that we indeed have made progress. Also at the general citizens' consciousness and awareness, it's not directly linked to the work of CICIG, but in general to the push forward of the peace accords. Guatemalan population has increased in the awareness of their own rights, mainly in indigenous populations, which is practically half of our country, and therefore they have better organizational tools. But if they do not count on the support of a judiciary that is parejo, that is indeed servicing the population in an equitable and efficient way, it's going to take a lot longer, and we are going to be facing monumental problems. That's why I want to underscore Connie's comment that we still need to work very hard on the reform of the judiciary, and CICIG is helping us out in that regard.
Let me just pick up on that, and Connie, you mentioned this earlier that the Ministerio Público, I think you said it's we still need CICIG. I mean, what are you interact? I mean, you're in your role as the vice president of the Guatemalan Export Chamber. You interact extensively with not only Guatemalan businesses but foreign businesses and investors in the country. What's at stake here? What are the implications if this process of institutional strengthening and consolidation is short-circuited and perhaps even reversed in some important ways?
Creo que lo que hemos caminado o lo que hemos llegado en Guatemala es a entender una cultura de legalidad. Eso creo que es lo más importante que hemos llegado. La corrupción estaba ya metida en todo el sistema, tanto el gobierno, realmente todo el sistema. Era difícil funcionar para las empresas, como hablaban, que no nos podemos dar el lujo de meter en la corrupción. Todas las que exportamos tenemos auditorías, tenemos compliance. Es muy importante para nosotros mantenerlos en la legalidad por los clientes que tenemos y por las exportaciones. Todo el sistema era realmente la corrupción había tomado completamente el sistema. Lo que empezó esta lucha contra la corrupción es que los guatemaltecos entendamos que la corrupción no es normal, que debe de haber legalidad, que así es como debemos de trabajar. Creo que en todo Centroamérica y en América Latina estamos viviendo exactamente lo mismo. Muchos de los países cercanos a nosotros, cuando salimos a las calles en el 2015, nos mandaban twitters de que bueno, Guatemala está hablando. O sea, yo creo que todos queremos pasar al lado, a trabajar en el lado de la legalidad, pero que es complicado porque es demasiados años con estos se han fortalecido mucho todos estos grupos y es muy difícil para un gobierno tan débil, las instituciones todavía que necesitan mucho más apoyo, que puedan luchar contra esa clase de corrupción tan enajenada, tan metida dentro del sistema.
Muchas gracias. Rachel, when you're not on the road, you're based in South Florida with the rest of the Millicom leadership. It's an area of the country where a lot of U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America seems to be made nowadays. What's your perspective on U.S. policy as it pertains to these issues, and do you think it's reflective of the interests of companies like yours and other U.S. businesses with investments in Guatemala?
Is this where I can claim that since I'm Swedish, I'm neutral and I don't actually take any view on political issues? But I think, as has been said already, international support in general and U.S. support in particular for helping develop these institutions, help strengthening the rule of law has been tremendously important. That is now somewhat in flux, and I don't think anyone will be able to say exactly what way that's heading in. I think one point to bear in mind is of course that work with these types of institutions and the fight against corruption is not a country-specific issue. It's not one government-specific issue. It's not only about U.S. policy. It's not only about the Guatemalan government. I mean, corruption is a global issue, and it needs global solutions, and it needs cooperation and coordination of a lot more stakeholders than perhaps the ones that we've touched on here, because it has a lot to do with money flow that goes cross-border into various institutions, etc. Now, there is no question, of course, that the U.S. has significant influence in the region, and that is a fact. That's not something that we take a view on. That's a fact, and we welcome support to anything that can help, ensure that the environment that we operate in, whatever country it is transparent, open, and competitive. I mean, that's our 101 in terms of an ideal investment climate.
Diplomatic and principled and true Swedish style. That's terrific. Eric, let me finish up with you, and then I want to open the floor to questions. But there is an election in this country in November. People might be aware. Seems to be some suggestion that the Democrats may take back control of the House of Representatives, in which case Congressman Engel, it's presumed, would be chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. What do you expect of U.S. policy, and more specifically congressional policy towards Guatemala on these issues? People talk about hearings, they talk about Global Magnitsky, talk about legislation, hearings. I mean, what do you see the next few months holding in terms of congressional attention and interest in this issue?
Thanks, Michael. I'd say there's two main areas, and I'd say, whether Democrats are in the majority or minority, I think these are areas that will be a focus among our members, and I think among Republicans as well. I would say foreign assistance would be one, and then sanctions would be another. On the foreign assistance front, I think, frankly, this matters a little bit less to the Guatemalan government. I think the sanctions piece is more important. So, but on foreign assistance, you look at the conditions that exist in the appropriations bills that actually give assistance to the central government of Guatemala. I mean, most people think the bulk of the assistance goes to the central governments of the Northern Triangle. That's actually not true. It's a small amount. But there is an amount of money that goes directly to the central governments, and it's highly conditioned. And essentially one of the conditions says that this money cannot go to the central governments unless they're cooperating with commissions that fight corruption. So really, you know, certainly the State Department could go ahead and certify Guatemala as meeting those conditions. But given the current situation, I mean, that doesn't really pass the laugh test, to say that the Guatemalan government is cooperating with commissions against impunity. So I imagine there will be a big fight over that if the executive branch decides to move forward on certifying Guatemala. So we'll have to stay tuned to see that. And then, of course, you know, going back to the issue you mentioned, also in the foreign assistance realm, on the jeeps, on other military equipment, I think there's going to be a real reassessment of what kind of equipment, military equipment, does the U.S. provide to Guatemala. When you're misusing these vehicles, when these are vehicles that should be used for counter-narcotics operations in rural areas, outside of big cities, and they're using to intimidate the very government that gave them to you, I think that's a really big deal. And, you know, we're starting to look at that in a bigger way. I think a lot of members are looking at that. But that's something that I would stay tuned to regardless of what happens in the election. I think the global Magnitsky sanctions, which allow the U.S. government to sanction individuals, take away visas, freeze assets, I think, frankly, that's what really matters more to Guatemalan government officials. And, you know, not just the government, but corrupt individuals, in general. So I think that's an area we push a lot. Congressman Engel led a bipartisan letter with Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, with a couple other members, with specific names of individuals from the Northern Triangle, who we think should be sanctioned. Again, that's something that is really out of our hands to a degree. We can push on that, but the executive branch ultimately makes those decisions. But I think that's really a big area that needs to be focused on, these individual sanctions. Moving forward, because I think we often think in the hemisphere about individual sanctions on Venezuela, Nicaragua, but this has been used in Guatemala in one case, and I think we should look at this more closely moving forward.
Terrific. All right. Well, we've got a ton of, I think, really interesting ideas on the table. I'm going to open it up. We'll take 3 questions at a time and come back to the panel. Take one from each section of the room, maybe. Please just introduce yourself. Keep your questions brief. And if your question is directed at a particular panelist, please mention that. Let's start there.
Good morning. Esther Perez Ruiz, Mission Chief for Guatemala at the IMF. A question for Eric. How much of a need for a reform CICIG? How much valid the arguments used by the president that CICIG could have abused power and not respected the presumption of innocence and respect of due process? And a question for Eduardo Stein. Do you envisage, assuming that CICIG stays in the country, how far or close is the judicial system from the transformation you alluded to? And you know, to go from enhanced investigation and prosecution capacities to the actual resolution of cases, which is taking a lot of time. And do you envisage such transformation in a context where political dialogue between the 3 Montesquieu powers is kind of broken?
Thank you.
Sí, gracias. Voy a formular en castellano mis preguntas. Primero al doctor Eduardo Stein.
Pregunta, no pregunta.
Una pregunta, una a 2. Está bien. Disculpe. O sea, al doctor Eduardo Stein, mi pregunta en el sentido de cómo avisora usted, doctor, la posibilidad de que Guatemala, ya con algunos pasos precisos, comience a salir de esta situación. Soy peruano, Luis Alberto Salgado, abogado en derechos humanos. Yo trabajé durante 5 años y medio en Guatemala, en Minugua, del 96 hasta dentro del 2002. Minugua, la Misión de Derechos Humanos. Y creíamos que estábamos sentando las bases para algo importante en Guatemala. Y creo que CICIG es la continuación lógica, institucional, de Minugua. Entonces, primero quería algunos pasos precisos, que más o menos más concretos que podría hacer. Y también el tema, cómo se concilia esto con los factores endógenos, internos en Guatemala, los problemas que ya los conocemos, lo conozco más o menos, casi como los de mi país, con los factores exógenos, o factor exógeno, ¿no? La gravitación del hegemón regional, y este concepto, cómo se concilia el globalismo con el concepto de patriotismo, si tiene algo que decirnos, doctor Stein. Y si me permite también, señor Camilleri, a nuestra colega, nuestra amiga, doctora Connie de Pais, que se haga un comentario sobre las convicciones democráticas del sector empresarial exportador de Guatemala. Hasta qué punto la diferencia entre ser democrático y estar democrático. Y lo digo, y disculpen que solamente apunten esto, porque el sector privado en América del Sur ha tenido un factor incidental negativo en los últimos tiempos con los casos de Odebrecht, Lavajato, Car Wash, Camargo Correa, en el Perú, en Colombia, en Argentina, Brasil, por supuesto. Entonces, la importancia de una especie de mutua autocrítica en el sector empresarial guatemalteco, hasta qué punto están dispuestos a respaldar sólidamente un proceso de reconstrucción institucional democrática en Guatemala, sobre la base de las expectativas de ganancias, de inversión, generación de empleo, porque creo que esto es clave, que los empresarios exportadores, industriales guatemaltecos tengan convicción democrática internalizada para apoyar este proceso de fortalecimiento de CICIG. Disculpe, ¿eh? Gracias.
Okay, let's take one more from right here in front.
Buenos días, mi nombre es Cristina, soy reportera para La Voz de América y me gustaría saber, en base a lo que hemos escuchado esta mañana, ¿cuál es su percepción sobre el futuro de Guatemala si la CICIG sale del país? Y hemos escuchado el discurso del presidente Jimmy Morales esta semana en la ONU, en donde acusa a esta organización sobre violaciones a los derechos humanos. ¿Qué me puede decir usted, señor ex vicepresidente? Y sobre todo hablar un poco de que si podríamos estar viendo una crisis en el país en cuestión de democracia, en cuestión de institucionalidad, podríamos estar a las miras de pronto en un futuro no muy cercano de ver una próxima Nicaragua en Guatemala o una próxima Venezuela en Guatemala?
Great. Let's start with those, and then if we have time, we'll take another round of questions. I think, Dr. Stein, a few of those were directed at you, so we'll let you start.
CICIG was conceived as a temporary mechanism, and it should remain so. However, perhaps we were not as aware of the depth, the scope, the reach, and the complexity of the infections that the three powers of the state were experiencing and how difficult it has become to uproot it. But definitely, although the picture is bleak in some important areas, we still see that we have experienced very strong and powerful private citizens' organizational expressions in public that have pressured Congress, that have pressured the executive, and that begin to pressure the judiciary in important ways. So much so as to stop already made decisions in Congress and force them to back away. This is no small thing. It had never happened in the past in our development as a democratic society. Secondly, I think that whatever perception President Morales has of things that have not worked correctly in the performance of CICIG, which in turn are things that can be argued with. He is blaming on CICIG things that are more pertaining to our judiciary in general, that is not working properly in the tribunals. All of these things can be managerially, administratively corrected. Fortunately, the window is open for negotiation between the United Nations General Secretariat and the Guatemalan government to find a way out of the impasse that has been created recently. And I hope that indeed there will be a negotiated way out that is beneficial to Guatemala, not to a personal private agenda, hopefully. Thirdly, there are several issues in your questions that I might want to try to answer by just painting a very rough draft of something that can occur in the next few months. If you think that transnational criminal organizations working in Central America with much success, because they are way ahead of the capacity of governments to legislate and to enforce the law. They have been very intelligent in taking advantage of modern technology in transport and communications. And of course, they have been also very successful in maintaining a penetration or that infection that I related to in the previous comments within some powers of the state. And they decide to create havoc to the United States planned security vision at a regional level. And then begin to open a corridor of Venezuelans in Central America all the way up to the Rio Grande. It's already beginning to happen in very small numbers. But they have the capacity to trigger this kind of phenomenal occurrence if they wanted to. And they can truly make a humongous mess of Central American isthmus. There are already 15 receiving countries of Venezuelan population in a refugee and migration phenomena that is totally new for the entire hemisphere. We have never ever experienced the numbers and complexities of what is going on over there. We have already had some of those phenomena during the war years in Central America, and we already have a complex agenda of irregular migration from Central Americans and Mexicans to the United States, which is a central part of U.S. policy towards our region. So there are vulnerabilities that go well beyond every individual state and state's capacity in Central America. We direly need a regional understanding that is constructive and that can indeed be a collaborative regional effort to make sure that we can do our homework local-wise, domestically-wise, with or without the type of mechanisms that CICIG represent. Lastly, if we see the reform of the judiciary near or far away, I would say that there are several categories of decision-making processes that are important, but that unfortunately we depend too much today on decisions of the structures within Congress. And I say unfortunately because the Guatemalan Congress has very eloquent signs of internal corruption mechanisms which have not been correctly addressed on the one hand, and on the other, because the procedures to nominate the justices of the Guatemalan Supreme Court, which come up together with the general elections next year, have been as well perversed. Originally, it was thought that including members of the universities or academia would create the guarantee so as to prevent those proceedings from being politically contaminated. It happened exactly the reverse. The universities were politically contaminated. Some even created paper law schools that had no students, just to have a dean participate in the commissions for the selection of justices. So we need to work harder on those fronts. There is an awareness in organized sectors of society, but also present in this very hall is a judge that was threatened personally just for trying exactly to do that cleansing. So we think there is still a fight in which civil society has to engage fully because the political parties are not doing their job.
Thank you, Dr. Stein. We have no experience in Washington with judicial selection processes that are politicized and complex. It's a very alien notion to us. Connie, perhaps you could address the question about the private sector and its commitment.
Ya. Voy a hablar de parte de la Cámara que represento, que son los exportadores. Realmente en la Cámara de Exportación tenemos clarísimas las necesidades de desarrollo del país. Si nosotros no logramos llegar a que las brechas se vayan acercando, no vamos a poder tener una economía sana en el país. Entonces creo que muchas de los problemas que vivimos en Guatemala, por ejemplo, la desnutrición, los problemas de educación, el sector privado a través de Fundesa, que es la Fundación para el Desarrollo, ha tenido muchos programas para apoyar al gobierno a ver dónde están las brechas y cómo se pueden hacer, y los programas siguen funcionando. Creo que ahora más que nunca estamos clarísimos de todo lo que hay que hacer porque llevamos paralizados los gobiernos, no hemos logrado cambiar la situación a través del gobierno durante los últimos años. Si entra un gobierno y cambia la situación, los programas anteriores, es muy importante y tenemos claro que necesitamos políticas públicas básicas de educación, de salud, que es lo que necesita el país para salir adelante. Creo que el sector privado tiene claro eso y estamos apoyando a lo que podamos en el gobierno y dentro de las empresas, supliendo un poco la falta de la capacidad del gobierno, dando educación. Muchas de las empresas tenemos también seguro social, pagamos el seguro social público y el privado para los colaboradores porque el sistema de salud está colapsado. Entonces, nosotros hemos tenido que agarrar mucha parte de eso para apoyar al país y obviamente lo que nos interesa es un país sano, un país desarrollado y un país educado.
Gracias. Rachel, there's a question about what the future looks like without CICIG. Is that something that you spend time thinking about, worrying about? What's your view on that?
Right. Yes, of course, we would think about that as we should and worry about it. I mean, of course, it is an institution that was set up to be a temporary structure. It is not for us to decide what is the specific end date of that temporary being. But as I said, we do believe that the support given by the international community and the work done by the institution has been incredibly helpful to raise standards, to create certain benchmarks, to create transparency that is much needed and wanted by investors to help strengthen institutions. I think that, from our perspective, Direct in Guatemala, we are a long-term investor. We've been there a long time. You don't pick up your towers and walk out overnight. That's not an option. Connie referred to some of the good work that's being done by the private sector more generally in terms of helping with socioeconomic development, and we have some great experiences from that as well, trying to do what we can with our technology, educating women in the use of smartphones and the use of mobile money, working with local civil society organizations like Shiva, who we have a fantastic cooperation with. I think that, we see it as a country that we want to be a partner to for a very long time to come, as much as we have been for a long time. We will stick to our policies. We will continue to work with zero tolerance for bribery and corruption. We will have to work with the stakeholders that exist in the country to try and make sure that can continue in the way we want to.
Great. Eric, final thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I'd just respond to the question in terms of the reform agenda. I think the first part of your question in terms of the Morales administration's allegations, I think they obviously go too far. I think there's a real conversation to have about reforms. And as we've had some of those conversations up here in Washington surrounding funding, I think that, there's those who credibly want to reform CICIG and work with the UN and the Guatemalan government to do so. And there are those who want to reform it to death, to use it as an excuse to kill the commission. So I think we have to separate what works and what doesn't. I mean, the idea of bringing in a deputy commissioner, sure, that makes sense. The idea of greater oversight by the UN and the UN Secretary General, that makes sense too. There's been something proposed of not letting Ivan Velásquez do press conferences. To me, that makes less sense. I mean, he should be able to get out his public message. So I think we just have to figure out a way to look at, which reforms are credible and which are not. It's always good to look at institution review what works and what doesn't. But I think, there are those who want to reform CICIG to death, and that we have to be wary of.
Great. We're up against our time here, and I want to be respectful of people's agendas. I know there were some other questions we didn't get to. I'm sure our speakers will be happy to hang out for a little while and have a private conversation if there's interest in doing so. I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank my colleagues here at the Dialogue and at the Council of the Americas for all their support with this event. And please join me in thanking our really wonderful speakers.